So perhaps you could kick things off here just by briefly explaining what is it that makes a fat saturated, what makes a fat mono-unsaturated, and what makes a fat polyunsaturated, and perhaps along the way we can just point out some of the common foods that we find these in typical diets today.
Sure. Yeah, that's a great place to start. I guess we could start first with the difference between fats and oils, because they're it's very similar. We typically say a fat is just a lipid that is solid at room temperature. You think butter, that's primarily saturated fat, but that's fat. Oils are also triglycerides. They're both triglycerides chemically, but oils are liquid at room temperature. So that's pretty simple. Typically, vegetable oils are liquid at room temperature. Animal fats typically are solid at room temperature. It's because of what you call saturation. And saturation is an odd term. It's not intuitive why it would be called that. If you look at the chemistry of the molecule, a fatty acid is a long chain of carbon atoms. It's a straight long chain. And there are single bonds, for your chemistry folks, single bonds between each carbon. And occasionally there's a double bond between each carbon. And when you have a double bond, that's what's called a point of unsaturation. So an unsaturated fatty acid has double bonds in it. A saturated fatty acid has no double bonds in it. And we call them saturated because the carbon chain is saturated with hydrogen atoms, which stick on the carbons. And if you got as many hydrogen atoms as possible, it's saturated. Polyunsaturated, there's mono-unsaturated and polyunsaturated. And mono, of course, is just one double bond. Polyunsaturated is two or more. And so we can go deeper if you want, but that's the beginning of it.
No, I think that's great. I think a little further into the conversation, we might break down the polyunsaturated fats a bit more and the two different pathways to help make sense of some of that with omega-3s and omega-6s. But when it comes to our health, I'm interested how this idea of saturation becomes important when we think about fats and human health outcomes, particularly cardiovascular disease. And perhaps it would be good to go back to the 1970s or even earlier, wherever you feel is appropriate, to kind of speak to why have scientists and physicians spent so much time considering the type of fat in our diet and why this is important in its relation to human health.
Yeah, it's a good question. It goes back about 100 years probably, and it goes back to cholesterol, because that was the reason saturated fat and polyunsaturated fat became interesting to nutrition scientists was because of what they do to cholesterol levels in the blood. And of course, cholesterol was linked to atherosclerosis, the coronary arteries getting plugged up with plaque. Cholesterol was very closely tied to that process. High levels of cholesterol in the blood meant high risk for heart disease, and low levels were good. And those studies came out of what they call the 7 country studies, Ansel Keys, where he looked around the world and found that countries that have high cholesterol levels, their people have high heart disease rates. And it was soon discovered that when you eat saturated fat, animal fat, it tends to raise your cholesterol levels. Mm-hmm. And if you eat a lot of vegetable oils or liquid oils, your cholesterol level goes down. Actually, when you remove saturated fat, your cholesterol level goes down. And so that's why it became important to attend to what kind of saturation, saturated or unsaturated fats, how much you eat in your diet because of the effects on cholesterol.
Can I ask you a question on the 7 country study and what you just mentioned there about how these different fats affect cholesterol? I think a lot of people who take a sort of position that epidemiology is flawed, often overlook the fact that what you're talking about there, perhaps the idea started in the epidemiological studies, but then there was a series of metabolic ward studies that very much were confirming exactly what you just spoke about, right?
Exactly, right. Right. The observations come from weaker study designs like epidemiology, but you can test them in the lab and then you can find out.
So tell me, where did your personal interest into fatty acids sort of begin, and was this taking shape after the research that you just spoke of then?
My particular interest grew from, actually I got my PhD in nutrition, and the study I did for my dissertation was what's the effect of a low vitamin C levels on blood cholesterol levels. And so I studied guinea pigs, and we got familiar with the blood cholesterol world. And then I went to do a postdoctoral fellowship with a doctor in Portland, Oregon named Bill Connor. And Bill's an MD, but he was very, very interested in how different kinds of fats in the diet affect cholesterol levels. And by the late 70s, we knew what I just told you, that high saturated fat diets raise cholesterol, and high polyunsaturated, that is to say the vegetable oil type fats, will lower cholesterol. But we didn't know if it was because, we didn't know why, for one thing. And one thing Dr. Connor was interested in was, is it the fact that the animal fats are solid, chemically solid at room temperature, and the vegetable oils are liquid at room temperature, or was it the fact that it actually was from an animal? There was an animalness to them, or a plantness to them. Which was it that was actually driving the cholesterol effect? And so he, I think rather cleverly at the time, thought, well, let's study a oil that is liquid at room temperature, but is from an animal, and that's fish, salmon, as it turned out.
Yeah, that's
so
very clever.
My assignment was to do a study, a metabolic ward study, as you just mentioned, where we fed very high levels of salmon oil or vegetable oil or saturated fat in 4-week slots to healthy volunteers to see what happened to the cholesterol and other blood lipids like triglycerides. And what we found was the saturated fat raised cholesterol, the vegetable oil lowered it, and the fish oil lowered it. And it also, the fish oil also lowered triglycerides, which the vegetable oils didn't do. So that was the first observation, I think, that fish oils are good for lowering triglyceride. But we were feeding outrageous amounts of oil. It was about 250 milliliters a day of salmon oil, about 20 to 25 grams of EPA DHA, which is, 5 times what Eskimos eat. But it was, so Dr. Connor just said, hit it with a big hammer, see what happens.
Sure. So that's not really obtainable in a kind of typical diet, but what you were able to produce was this result that spoke to the fact that it's not necessarily the source, animal or plant, that is having this effect on the cholesterol. It's the type of fat being sort of
the chemical composition of the oil, right?
Right. So I'm not sure if we're going to go too far into the weeds, but I might ask you, and feel free to keep it as surface level as you think is best. What is it about a fat that is saturated and a fat that is polyunsaturated that causes them to have differing effects on cholesterol?
Yeah, and that was a long search to try, and we have to really get a little bit more specific than cholesterol now, because we need to talk about the two ways that cholesterol is carried in the blood: LDL, low density lipoproteins, and high density, what's called the good cholesterol and the bad cholesterol, or vice versa. Because LDL, low density lipoproteins, are particles that carry cholesterol. Cholesterol is a lipid; it doesn't dissolve in the blood, which is water, so it has to be carried in a particle. And it's the LDL particles that are the ones that are causing heart disease, causing arthritis or atherosclerosis. And when we looked more carefully, it wasn't just the total cholesterol that went up when you ate saturated fat. It was the LDL particle numbers went up. And somebody eventually figured out, and I can't remember who, that when you feed, and these studies were done in animals because you had to take out the liver to understand it, because the liver is what controls LDL cholesterol levels. And they found that when you're in animals on a high saturated fat diet, the membranes, the cell membranes in the liver, and I guess I should also mention that the way that the LDL cholesterol levels are controlled is really by how many what they call LDL receptors are in the liver. These are little things that sit on the outside of the liver cells, and they will bind LDL particles and pull them into the cell, remove them from the blood. So if you have more active LDL receptors in your liver, your LDL levels will go down. But they found out that a high saturated fat diet changes the number of those receptors on liver cells. So there's fewer LDL receptors in the liver. So there's fewer places to remove LDL particles from the blood, so the levels stay up. And if you put polyunsaturated fat in, there's more receptors, they're more active, and they will, like a sponge, pull the cholesterol particles into the liver and out of the blood. So it had to do really with the fluidity, we call it, of the cell membrane and how it affected LDL receptors.
Fascinating. So with all of that in mind and the research that was kind of building up to the 1980 period, I'd like to hear your view on something. I see a lot of folks online saying that the 1980 guidelines were misinformed, that these guidelines are, in some ways, I hear people going as far as saying that they were responsible for the incredibly high numbers of, or the rates of obesity and chronic disease that we see today. But what I'm hearing from you, and also my read of the science, is that it was pretty clear reducing saturated fat, particularly in place particularly with polyunsaturated fats, was beneficial. And when I look at those 1980 guidelines, although there was a kind of emphasis, a low fat emphasis, there was a very strong emphasis on saturated fat being the key fat to reduce. So I'm wondering what your view is on the 1980 guidelines and how you feel when you hear that kind of view that they're to blame in some way for today's health that we see.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. There wasn't, if you really read the guidelines, they emphasize reducing saturated fat and keeping mono-unsaturates and polyunsaturates high. But when it got translated into the lay world, it was just low fat, which was not exactly what was intended, I think. And exactly how that happened, I can't remember how that got miscommunicated. But low fat the food industry picked up on low fat, and they made lots of low fat products, but they replaced the fat with sugar, essentially. And that was a problem. It wasn't the low fatness per se of the recommendations. I think it was what the food industry did to replace and make those foods palatable in a low fat form by adding more sugar and other kind of artificial components, I guess, fibers that made it feel like fat. So I do think the increase in sugar intake was a unintended consequence of those guidelines.
I guess this just speaks to, if you're going to reduce something in the diet, a lot of the benefit is derived by what you replace it with.
This episode is proudly brought to you by Inside Tracker. Track your blood biomarkers, understand your biological age, and receive personalized lifestyle tips backed by evidence to optimize your health. To get started with Inside Tracker today and get 20% off your first purchase, head to insidetracker.com/Simon. That's insidetracker.com/Simon for 20% off.
So today in 2022, as we're some 40 years further down the track, would you say that it is now, it's certain, we're certain that saturated fats increase risk of cardiovascular disease and polyunsaturated fats lower risk? And from a mechanistic point of view, is that driven, if you agree with that statement, is that driven mostly entirely through cholesterol, or more specifically the ApoB containing lipoproteins, or are there other mechanisms at play here like inflammation?
Yeah. Is that true that saturated fat is still the bad boy? Even that's complicated now, and I'm sure you're aware. There's no question that eating higher saturated fat diets do raise cholesterol. And it was always assumed that anything that raises cholesterol is going to raise risk for heart disease. There was kind of the A equals B equals C kind of thing. A fair amount of epidemiology now has, these big meta-analyses of observational studies have looked at saturated fat intake in many, many populations and compared it to risk for actually developing heart disease events. And it's not quite so clear anymore that a higher saturated fat diet does increase risk for actual cardiac events. It could be that just the entire background diet has changed, the lifestyles have changed, and many other variables that you just can't control. But it's, I think the consensus is for sure that trans fats, which we may get into, the industrially produced trans fats are bad, no question. Saturated fat is a little bit of a question mark. And it probably has to do with how much polyunsaturated fat you eat at the same time. So it's still, I'm not sure it's much clearer than it, and maybe it's even less clear than it was in the 80s now.
Do you think some of that comes down to what the diet composition of the low saturated fat diets looks like in those observational studies, and whether that's a kind of high quality diet or perhaps a lower quality diet with lots of refined carbohydrates?
Well, it certainly can be. As you know, you can eat a plant-based diet that is really pretty crappy, nutrient-wise. Right?
Certainly, yeah.
You pick the wrong stuff. And I think that's probably what happened. I think particularly of what's called the PREDIMED study from Spain, a very important study, but the average American Heart Association guidelines diet was the control diet, and compared to a Mediterranean diet, and the American Heart Association diet had more heart disease, and it was low fat. What the other components are of it, I don't really remember at the moment, but I do remember thinking, oh, great. Now, so the diet the American Heart Association is promoting is now the bad guy. And the Mediterranean diet's the good guy. If we really knew what a Mediterranean diet was exactly, that's still up in the air, I think.
Sure. And I guess the other bit of complexity here is that not all saturated fats are equal and have the sort of same potential, it seems, when it comes to raising cholesterol, and that, saturated fats like palmitic or myristic and lauric, they seem to raise cholesterol, but others like stearic acid or short chain fatty acids, which are all the rage now with the microbiome, they're also saturated but do not seem to affect cholesterol in the same way. Do you think that's another sort of layer of complexity here?
Yes, yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because it's really quite naive. I mean, when we get even into the omega-6 and omega-3 polyunsaturates, it's naive to classify these based on their chemistry, based on their because all the saturated fats get painted with the same brush, but they shouldn't, like as you just said. Sure. They don't all have the same behavior. And then the same way plays with the omega-3s and the omega-6s. So we got to get away from these rigid classifications.
These umbrella terms, it's similar with carbohydrates. I often say that a carbohydrate could speak to, a food like a jelly bean all the way to a black bean. And we know we know that those are are likely to have quite different effects on our physiology and health outcomes.
I like that analogy. I might have to use that for fats.
You can borrow that as much as you want.